When I was a kid, three roads in the guise of racing games took a vice grip upon me in my early life: Midnight Club, Need for Speed, and Burnout. The later was the most arcade-like racing series at the time. It unapologetically distanced itself from the racing sim stratosphere that was known at that time. Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport would open up a market within the console crowd, while others, like Assetto Corsa, iRacing, and Live for Speed would propagate within the PC crowd, and would expand even further as racing sim equipment became cheaper. As for me, I quickly gravitated towards the arcade realm for the bigger emphasis on making driving fun, even at the expense of reality. Burnout for me was the perfect arcade racer. It was fast, fluid, and snappy. It was, however, also frustrating and sometimes difficult. At one point when I had a friend come over, he was watching me rage at Burnout 2 like crazy, and I yelled that the game was God's fault. And because I was hyper-competitive and reckless during my early years of playing racing games, I said a lot of ridiculous shit. But today, for the first time in over 20 years, I'll be revisiting the first two Burnout games back to back, and I'll go through each one and share my thoughts on this legendary franchise. Before they took the reins of Need for Speed with mixed results, such as Most Wanted 2012, Rivals, and Unbound, Criterion Games had made their own racing games, such as Speedboat Attack, Redline Racing, and Trickstyle, old and long forgotten games in this day and age that are worth having a look at. But their rise to success wouldn't come until they had begun creating the Burnout series. In 2001, Criterion and Acclaim would release the first Burnout on the PS2, and a year later on the Xbox and GameCube. It was a high-octane, high-risk racer where you drove a handful of different cars on different tracks, having their own variety, tricks and turns included, where you were also at the mercy of the game's traffic that would punish you severely for not paying attention. The game did reasonably well and had garnered positive reviews across the board, setting the foundations for Criterion to become a household name in the future. So how is the first Burnout? Well, like just about every racing game at this stage, it was never about having a cinematic story-rich experience that happened to involve cars. You would have a number of different modes, like Single Race, Time Attack, Face Off, which was a duel between you and one other car, and your Championship mode, that you would go through in order to unlock tracks, tournaments, and face-off modes. It also had a multiplayer mode, which was common for a lot of 2000s arcade races, which was mainly split-screen mode, which is unfortunately a thing of the past nowadays. The Championship mode, depending on your driving ability and your traffic awareness, can be completed in a fairly short amount of time. There are 6 in total, some with 3 races and others with a single race that's actually a really long circuit track. Face Off is, as I said, a dual race where you go up against an opponent with a unique car. Beating them unlocks the car they drive, and you can use it in the other modes. Free Run lets you go through the tracks without the worry of traffic. It is great if you're planning a speedrun or just want to memorize the roads. The setting is just a placeholder for the races to commence. There's no lore or backstory to uncover, unless you count the development of this game. But in any case, you uncover the rest of the game by completing the Championship Grand Prix races, as well as the 4 face-off races. After that, you are basically finished with the game. But of course, if you wish to continue playing it further, there is also the survival mode, which is like a time trial, but with a caveat added to it. You crash into any vehicle or any wall or object, and the event is immediately over. So it becomes more of a case to determine your knowledge and skills at this game. With the modes out of the way, let's look into the overall game itself. 2001 was a year where there were a fair number of games that had begun to further develop the potential wonders of 3D graphics. Gran Turismo 3 was one such game that still amazes me to this day, and it looks even better if you manage to upscale its resolution on top of reshades. But Burnout 1 in comparison is admittedly a rough game from a visual perspective, and even more so now as you can see here. When I first revisited this game, I didn't realize that the game had widescreen support until way after I had finished the game, or I had just forgotten that it was even there. But here it is anyway. My playthrough consisted of thick cars thanks to the standard aspect ratio, but nevertheless, the game is clear enough for the most part to not strain your eyes of dated PS2 graphics. Looking further, the game is pretty rough around the edges. The environments are different enough but worsen as you look at it with a closer eye. The car models are the standout in the visual department. You have a small but nice selection of cars to play with. Each car is identified by 3 things: their class, shape, and stats. In terms of the latter, there's not a great deal of difference besides the handling. the first car has amazing handling but not necessarily the best speed, whereas the muscle car has the opposite issues. And even then, all the cars are pretty balanced in regards to acceleration and top speed, because of the tendency of cars to crash into traffic, and also due to the chaotic nature of the tracks, you can generally keep up with your opponents anyway, even with the first car, and the same is true for when they catch up to you. Models are made up and not based on any real life cars, but sometimes I find it refreshing because it allows the artist to go wild and not stress too much about whether the design and application of the car is practical or not. Burnout 1 just gives you nice looking cars that are enjoyable to drive, that's it. During the races, your car has a boost meter, which is increased by doing near misses, driving on the wrong side of the road, or drifting. Once it's filled up, you can initiate burnout mode or boost mode, which is like nitrous, giving you higher speed, which can be helpful when you need to catch up, but it's also riskier due to the presence of traffic. The handling model of the driving is snappy around corners. You go fast, but not so much to the point where you're going to be overlapping people. Traffic will be your biggest threat, and that is because when you crash into any of them, or just into walls really hard, you're stuck into a crashing animation that lasts seconds, and at crucial moments during a race it can mean the difference between winning and losing. It would be easy to say to never crash, but in Burnout, it's not just a case of how, but when, because it absolutely will happen, and there are times where traffic is impossible to avoid. The random nature of the game's traffic evens out the playing field though. Cars can keep up with each other for the most part. You'll generally have to stay focused when first because they're never too far behind. Car customization is non-existent here. You have the choice of colors which are limited, and you have the option for either automatic or manual. But it really makes no difference at all in this game. So don't be like me and just make it easier on yourself by choosing automatic. Otherwise though, it just boils down to preference, so do whatever you want. The game's difficulty is a wild card. Sometimes it's just not your day, and it can lead to some really frustrating moments sometimes. But if you're generally experienced in racing games, you shouldn't have too much trouble for the most part, and given the content count, it's a pretty small game by comparison to its sequels. Now this was before the later titles in the franchise. Criterion had decided to make their own music, instead of obtaining licenses from other artists to put their music forth. To be honest, there really isn't anything noteworthy to talk about in this category. The cars and the sounds of crashes are okay, but again, they generally go unnoticed due to the concentration required to succeed in the races. The sound of the game is something that's just kinda there really. I didn't take much notice of it myself. It's not terrible, but it's not memorable altogether. The game's biggest strength though is its handling and sense of speed, as well as its arcade-like feeling and the crashes that come along with it. But when you really put it all together as a complete package, as a game in the 2000s era of racing, and when you compare it to its sequels, it's more of a proof of concept. Something that could be seen as a blueprint referenced by Criterion that they would use when they would later work on a bigger and better version of this game, which would come in the guise of Burnout 2: Point of Impact. A year later, after the release of the first Burnout, Criterion were hard at work to make a more ambitious sequel of the original Burnout, to carry the torch, so to speak. It offered way more cars, more races, more tracks with better graphics and better detail to the car models and environments, and also new modes. It was in essence the same game, but at the same time it took everything the first game did and improved on it in every category. The Xbox and GameCube would get a port a year after the release of this game. Coming from the first game, you have the same modes, except for Survival, which is canned, and replaced with modes like Pursuit and Crash, and of course the Driver's Ed mode, which functions as like a tutorial, introducing you to the game's mechanics. Now you can complete each test and move on, or you can grind out for the gold medals and unlock the Driver's Ed vehicle, which is not too bad in itself. The Pursuit mode takes you into a police car, and you use it to bring down the health meter of a racer. These events are made available in both Championship mode and the Custom Championship mode you get after fully completing the first one. Each completion of the Pursuit events unlock the car that you take down, and you can also do the Pursuit modes in its own mode, by choosing your car and the opponent's car. The mode is okay, but sometimes the rubber banding aspect of the AI can be an annoying factor, and depending on your ability to catch up, you may have to restart a few times in order to get it right. It's just a matter of trial and error really, but the mode isn't too difficult. The crash mode lets you pick out a car of your own choosing, and you have to cause as much damage as possible, which is calculated by a multiplier and the value of the cars. Trucks, and buses that get into the accidents. You can choose to complete them and be content with bronze and silver medals, or you can go for gold. Either way, it's up to you. It's a fun mode, and it's enhanced by the game's superior damage modeling and car physics. There are 2 championships this time around, and they each have their own races. They both consist of Grand Prix tournaments, face-off races, and pursuit modes. Like the first, you complete them in order until you finish their respective final events. They each have the same credits when you finish the final race, and when you complete both championships, the game is essentially finished, and you just have the other modes to entertain yourself with. Multiplayer is there too, split screen included, but I don't think there are a lot of people left that make the time for this game. There would be some though, even if it's just a handful, you'll probably just have to search out for them yourself. Moving on. Across the board, the game is just a huge improvement. The driving feels a lot more satisfying in comparison, but familiar enough where you can adjust fairly easily if you've just come off the original game. Graphically, it holds up a lot better too. Environments are varied and the city sections are still fairly pleasing to look at. The speed and velocity isn't too blurry to the point where you can't see anything. Most of the cars from the original Burnout carry over, and now have more colours to pick from, but still no customization options. However, the roster of the cars are bigger this time around, with newer and more unique vehicles, from a hot rod, to a NASCAR, to a classic 50s Chevy-like car, and a car that looks like it was from the 30s. And of course, once you get into the custom championship mode, you get to enjoy upgraded versions of the stock cars that have really nice designs and look like they came off from the Fast and the Furious, which wouldn't surprise me since my favourite car in the game, the custom coupe, looks like Brian's Eclipse. Once again, all the cars are fairly balanced for the most part, but naturally you would gravitate to the faster cars anyway, and by the end I just stuck to the custom models. During races, the gap can be a lot higher this time around, due to rubber banding being more of a thing. Even during races, where I didn't screw up, sometimes an opponent would just be above and beyond the competition, and I'd have to restart races so it wouldn't happen again. The distance factor between cars is generally in seconds, and again, not to a point where you're overlapping them and them around. The cars, altogether for the most part, are all usable. I hate this car though, it is a piece of shit. Don't use it. You have the same boost meter from the first one, and it's something I feel like I use more often compared to the first because of 2 things. One, when I was in dire straits and needed to catch up fast, or when you're driving well, you can get a continuous burnout or boost that follows after you've exhausted the first batch. I found this one to be somewhat harder than the first one, especially in the later tournaments where you have way more races to complete and there's more pressure to not screw up so you don't have to do it all over again. But again, it was a matter of your mood and your luck during races. Because of the increased amount of content, it'll take a lot longer this time around, but what's there is more than enough to keep you occupied. The soundtrack's a lot better. The main theme itself is really catchy, and the music has this effect during races where it bounces from being somewhat calm to intense when you initiate boost mode. But again, it's all in-game music, so no licensed stuff. That wouldn't come in until Burnout 3 Takedown. Cars and crashes have gotten noticeable improvements, sound bites are louder and more distinguishable between cars. But again, it's not the focal point of this game. Burnout 2 is all about the enjoyment of chaos in a race, the risks you take to gain ridiculous speed, all in the name of winning. In contrast to its predecessor, it overshadows it completely. It's a prime example of how to improve upon what was already accomplished, without the risk of it being redundant. Playing this game made me forget the original Burnout entirely, and that's something that not a lot of sequels can accomplish. But Burnout 2 Point of Impact remains a great arcade racer that embraces its concepts that were bestowed upon from the original. If you had to pick one of the two, I would say start with this one. But in saying that, I think that both games still hold up pretty well, even the first one, because it is pure in its identity as an arcade racer. It didn't try to be the best of both worlds, like Forza Horizon or the recent Need for Speeds. Criterion threw the racing sim idea out of the window and just presented a simple but fun arcade racer. Burnout 1 is pretty dated though, and pretty bare bones, but it is worth checking out for the historical value. And if you just want something retro that is quick and fun, then this is the game that is a good start to that sort of thing. Burnout 2 though, in comparison, is where the series would really begin its path to greatness, which would be exceeded by Burnout 3 Takedown, which is my favourite one in the whole series. Unfortunately, these two games don't get talked about enough, and in my opinion they shouldn't be forgotten so easily. They're a product of a much simpler time in arcade races where we didn't need a story. We didn't need a universe to drown ourselves in. We just needed a nice car that was fun to drive with fun physics. That's it. And that's what these two games did. And over 20 years later, I can finally close the chapter on these two. Definitely pick these two up if you want good early arcade racing. Thank you for watching.